This is called A Swarm of Dawns. There's a lot to be written in the Book of Errors. The old scribe is blind for all practical purposes. He has no imagination, and field mice have gnawed away his source text for their nesting. I loved you first. There's a lot to be written in the Book of Errors. The old scribe is blind for all practical purposes. He has no imagination, and field mice have gnawed away his source texts for their nesting. I loved you first, I think, when you stood in the kitchen sunlight and the lazy motes of summer dust while I sliced a nectarine for Moroccan salad and the 7-league boots of your private grief. Maybe the syntax is a little haywire there. Left to itself, wire must act like Paul Klee with a pencil. Hay is the old English word for strike. You strike down grass, I guess, when it is mown. Mown. The field mice devastated the monastery garden. Maybe because it was summer and the dusks were full of marsh hawks and the night was soft with owls, the mice couldn't leave the herbs alone, gnawing the roots of rosemary, nibbling at sage and oregano and lemon thyme. It's too bad eglantine isn't an herb because it's a word I'd like to use here. Her coloring was a hybrid of rubbed amber and the little flare of dawn rose in the kernel of an almond. It's a wonder to me that I have fingertips.
Do you believe there's a palette of emotions or ideas, which is the province of narrative, as opposed to palette, which might be the province of lyric? And is there a distinction that you could define in terms of the kinds of colors that narrative, not palette, could give us as opposed to lyric? And for example, if, my example was going to be the emotions that a reader feels when Anna Karenina throws herself under a train, can that be evoked by a lyric action? But first I'd like to know about the prose and about what you're accessing, and can it be accessed? Because you often intermingle, if people here might not be familiar with the poems on the page, you often intermingle prose and verse in large architectural structures, and it feels very much like you need the prose to get to certain things that you otherwise would have used verse to get to, emotions and ideas.
Yeah.
Doing my best. He's so brilliant, you have to sneak around him a bit.
It's all of all of these seem like, what's reality, and what is the imagination, how is poetry trying to get to it? And it seems to me, and if it were a question as simple as that, you could produce a bunch of philosophical questions.
But how do you make the decision, this is going to go into prose?
Well, I would say it's more like when I was doing it, I went through a period when I just was writing a lot of prose. It didn't feel to me like the palette, it felt to me like the brush. Mm. That is, that there are certain, it wasn't so much that the emotion, though that's an interesting question, that the emotions are different that you get in poetry or prose, but that the brush had a different kind of energy. I love fiction, and I like the rhythms of sentences in novels, and so it felt very much to me like when I would start to do a piece of prose that I was somehow calling my work. I didn't say I was writing prose poems because I've never understood the term, but the rhythm felt like I'd get what the rhythm was, in the way that you read, not Henry James, but even a Le Carré novel. He would say, on that drizzly afternoon, when the old woman, Prague was often dark already at that hour, was walking down the street in her habitual but not this endless suspension was the rhythm of that kind of sentence. And the rhythm of a Hemingway sentence would be something else, the rhythm of Toni Morrison's sentence something else, that I would feel like there would be a certain kind of rhythm to do with prose, with as the brush you were painting with, that I could work in. Why I was working in prose, I know that what the evolution of it was, which was that I was writing essays, and sometimes I'd find myself laboring over a paragraph in an essay to get it right. And then at a certain point I started writing one paragraph prose things as a form. And it did seem to me that I could get at materials that I didn't. Maybe it's because I don't have the skills in verse, but for example, in the prose piece called Tall Windows, say, you know, the wife who had strict Calvinist principles, you could find a way, did this in 1939, and in 1940 the Nazis came. I would have to work up a verse form, which Yeats did. You could do it in order to figure out how to hammer that out. And it did seem like you could do it more efficiently.